What would you do if you discovered that the ordinary house at the end of your street concealed horrors beyond imagination? A place where the boundaries of human depravity were tested against the backdrop of picturesque rural America? The small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania, seemed like any other sleepy community nestled in the rolling hills of Lancaster County, until a chance discovery in the spring of 2007 exposed a darkness that had festered there for decades. The Ashford family home, a weathered Victorian structure with peeling white paint and overgrown gardens, held secrets within its walls that would shake the foundations of the community and leave investigators haunted for years to come. If you appreciate these dark, documented cases from our troubled past, consider subscribing to support our continued research into the shadows of human history. The discovery began with Carol Winters, a social services worker with 23 years of experience handling cases of child neglect and abuse throughout Lancaster County. Nothing in her extensive career had prepared her for what awaited inside the Ashford residence that April morning. The visit had been routine, prompted by neighbors reporting concerns about Margaret Ashford, a 67-year-old widow who had become increasingly reclusive over the previous months. According to municipal records, Margaret lived alone since the death of her husband Edward Ashford in 1998, but her recent erratic behavior at the local grocery store and an apparent deteriorating mental state prompted a welfare check. Carol recalled the weight of unease that settled over her as she approached the house, noting the curtains drawn tight across every window despite the pleasant spring weather. The porch creaked beneath her feet, wooden boards warped from years of neglect, as the scent of something fetid and unpleasant drifted from beneath the door. When her knocks went unanswered, Carol contacted the local authorities who arrived 20 minutes later. Officer James Kendrick, then a rookie with the Millfield Police Department, described the scene in his official report with clinical detachment that barely concealed his horror. The front door had been unlocked, opening into a dimly lit foyer where the wallpaper peeled in long strips from moisture damage. The smell intensified inside. A mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something more disturbing that neither Carol nor Officer Kendrick could immediately identify. What they found in the kitchen would be the first indication that something was deeply wrong in the Ashford home. Margaret sat at a table covered in old newspapers and unwashed dishes, her gray hair matted against her scalp, wearing a stained nightgown despite it being midday. She seemed unsurprised by their arrival, almost as if she had been waiting. According to Officer Kendrick, she spoke in a calm, measured voice that contrasted sharply with her disheveled appearance. The words she uttered would haunt those present for years to come. She simply said, "They need to be fed soon. They get upset when they're hungry." When asked who needed feeding, Margaret's response was chilling in its matter-of-factness. "My girls, of course. They're waiting downstairs." This statement immediately raised alarms for Carol, as county records showed no other residents at the address. And Margaret's two daughters, twins named Sarah and Emily, had reportedly moved away decades earlier after graduating high school in 1979. The discovery of a heavy padlock on the basement door transformed concern into dread. Officer Kendrick requested backup before proceeding further, sensing that whatever waited below required additional support. The basement door was located off the kitchen, a solid oak barrier that seemed newer and more secure than anything else in the decaying house. 3 separate locks secured it, requiring keys that Margaret reluctantly surrendered from a chain around her neck. According to statements later given by Officer Kendrick, Margaret's demeanor changed as they approached the door, shifting from cooperative detachment to anxious protection. She repeatedly warned them that her girls were sensitive to light and unused to strangers, suggesting they might become agitated. What awaited the officers and social worker as they descended the creaking wooden stairs into the darkness below would forever alter their understanding of human cruelty. The stench that greeted them was overwhelming, forcing Officer Kendrick to retreat momentarily to compose himself. Carol Winters, despite her years of experience with neglect cases, would later request a temporary leave of absence following the discovery. The basement had been converted into a crude living space divided by hanging sheets into separate areas. Battery-powered lamps provided minimal illumination, revealing the squalid conditions in which the inhabitants had existed. The concrete floor was partially covered with stained rugs, while buckets in the corners served as makeshift toilets. But what caught the attention of the authorities were the 2 figures huddled together on a stained mattress in the farthest corner, their pale skin almost luminescent in the dim light. According to the official report filed that day, the 2 adult women appeared to be in their mid-40s, though their exact age was difficult to determine due to their condition. Both exhibited signs of severe neglect and possible developmental disabilities. Neither was clothed properly, wearing only tattered nightgowns despite the basement's damp chill. Most disturbing were the physical abnormalities immediately apparent to the officers. Both women displayed similar facial features with unusually close-set eyes, malformed jaws, and pronounced overbites. Their limbs appeared disproportionate to their bodies, with elongated fingers and curved spines that prevented them from standing fully upright. What they found next would change everything about the investigation. As medical personnel arrived to assess the women, who were later identified as Jessica and Amanda Ashford, ages 42 and 40, respectively, they discovered that neither woman had ever received proper medical care. More shocking was the revelation that neither woman appeared in any birth records, school enrollments, or Social Security documentation. According to all official records, these women did not exist, but the true horror of the Ashford family was only beginning to surface. The basement also contained a rudimentary filing system, a series of journals kept by Margaret Ashford detailing the birth and development of her special girls over 4 decades of isolation. The journals presented a disturbing timeline that investigators would spend months piecing together. The first entry dated back to 1965, shortly after Margaret married Edward Ashford, describing her disappointment at being unable to conceive children naturally. Subsequent entries revealed that Edward's brother, Richard Ashford, had moved into the family home in 1967 following a divorce. According to Margaret's writings, it was Richard who first suggested an unthinkable solution to their childlessness, one that would spiral into decades of abuse and isolation. Detective Samuel Cooper, who led the investigation after the initial discovery, described the journals as the most disturbing documents I've encountered in 30 years of law enforcement. The entries detailed how Margaret had given birth to twin girls in 1967, fathered by her brother-in-law Richard in a planned arrangement approved by her husband Edward. The birth occurred at home with no medical assistance, allowing the family to avoid registration of the births. The twins, Sarah and Emily, were raised normally and allowed to attend school as they displayed no obvious physical abnormalities that might raise suspicions. But there was one detail no one dared to mention openly during the early investigation, a revelation so disturbing that several officers requested reassignment from the case. According to Margaret's journals, when Sarah and Emily reached adolescence, Richard and Edward implemented the next phase of what they termed their family project. The men had become obsessed with fringe eugenics theories and isolated genetic lineages, believing they could create a purified family line through controlled breeding. The journals documented in clinical detail how, beginning when the twins were 16 years old, they were coerced into intimate relations with their own father and uncle, resulting in pregnancies that were hidden from the community. The women found in the basement, Jessica and Amanda, were not Margaret's daughters, as she had initially claimed to authorities. According to the journal entries and subsequent DNA testing, they were her granddaughters, born to the twins Sarah and Emily in 1981 and 1983, respectively. The pregnancies were concealed from the community, with the twins kept home from school during their later terms under the pretense of extended illnesses. After graduation, Sarah and Emily reportedly moved away to attend college in another state, when, in reality, they remained hidden in the home until an opportunity arose for their permanent departure. The fate of Sarah and Emily remained unclear from Margaret's journals, with entries becoming increasingly erratic after 1985. Detective Cooper's investigation would eventually uncover property records for a remote cabin in the Allegheny National Forest, purchased by Edward Ashford in 1984. When authorities searched the location in June 2007, they discovered human remains buried behind the structure. Forensic analysis would later confirm the remains belonged to 2 adult females, approximately 25 years of age at time of death, who shared close genetic markers with Jessica and Amanda Ashford. Evidence of blunt force trauma to the skulls suggested homicide, though the case remains officially unsolved due to insufficient evidence linking Edward or Richard directly to the deaths. The journals recovered from the basement documented the development of Jessica and Amanda from birth through adulthood, recording their physical abnormalities and developmental delays with disturbing scientific detachment. Margaret noted their sensitivity to light, attributed to their pale blue eyes and lack of exposure to natural sunlight. Their motor skills developed slowly, with neither child walking properly until age 4. Speech remained limited throughout their lives, with their vocabulary never progressing beyond that of young children. Most tellingly, Margaret documented the gradual emergence of physical traits consistent with genetic disorders associated with inbreeding, including facial asymmetry, dental malformations, and curvature of the spine. However, there was something even more disturbing buried within Margaret's records that investigators discovered only after weeks of cataloging evidence. A separate journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the basement wall, contained entries dating from 1987 through 1992, documenting 3 additional pregnancies resulting in infants with severe congenital abnormalities. According to Margaret's clinical notes, these infants, all male, died within days or weeks of birth and were buried on the property. Ground-penetrating radar would later confirm the presence of small remains in the far corner of the Ashford property, beneath a garden that neighbors recalled Margaret tending meticulously each spring. The physical examination of Jessica and Amanda revealed years of neglect and isolation. Dr. Eleanor Phillips, the physician who conducted their initial assessment, noted in her report that both women showed signs of severe malnutrition, vitamin D deficiency, and untreated infections. Their teeth were in advanced states of decay, while their muscles had atrophied from confinement in the limited space of the basement. Most concerning were the numerous poorly healed fractures discovered during X-ray examinations, suggesting repeated injuries that had never received medical attention. According to Dr. Phillips, the pattern of breaks in the women's arms was consistent with defensive wounds, indicating they had likely been subjected to physical abuse throughout their lives. Until one piece of the puzzle revealed the unthinkable truth about the extent of the Ashford family's depravity. During the extensive search of the property, investigators discovered a hidden room accessible only through a small crawl space in the basement's northern wall. The space, measuring approximately 8 feet square, contained a single mattress, restraints fashioned from leather belts, and a collection of Polaroid photographs dating from 1993 through 2006. Detective Cooper refused to describe the contents of these photographs in detail to the press, stating only that they documented continued sexual abuse of both women by Edward and Richard Ashford. The room also contained crude implements that Dr. Phillips later identified as having been used for home gynecological examinations and possibly termination of pregnancies. Richard Ashford, who would have been 78 at the time of the discovery, was nowhere to be found. Investigation into his whereabouts revealed that he had died in 2002 from heart failure, with his death certificate signed by a local physician who had no knowledge of the women kept in the basement. Edward Ashford had died 5 years earlier in 1998 from stroke complications, leaving Margaret as the sole caretaker of Jessica and Amanda. According to neighbors interviewed during the investigation, neither Richard nor Edward had been particularly social, but neither had raised suspicions within the community. Harold Jenkins, who had lived next door to the Ashfords for over 30 years, stated that Edward had worked as an accountant at a firm in Lancaster, commuting daily and occasionally exchanging pleasantries over the fence, but never inviting neighbors into the home. The neighbor stated that Margaret had been more outgoing in her younger years, participating in community events and attending church regularly until the mid-1980s, when she gradually withdrew from social circles. She always had an excuse why we couldn't visit, Jenkins recalled in his statement to police. First it was renovations, then it was Edward's health, always something keeping people at arm's length. Most telling was his observation that after Edward's death in 1998, Margaret rarely left the house except for brief trips to purchase groceries and other necessities, often at odd hours when she was unlikely to encounter neighbors. The investigation uncovered a system of careful precautions taken by the Ashford family to maintain their secret over decades. The basement windows had been bricked over and concealed behind shrubs from the outside, making the subterranean living space invisible to casual observation. Soundproofing materials lined the ceiling of the basement, explaining why neighbors never reported hearing unusual noises despite living in close proximity. Most cunningly, Edward had installed a separate electrical circuit for the basement that bypassed the main meter, preventing unusual power consumption from raising questions. These deliberate measures demonstrated a calculating methodology behind what investigators described as one of the most organized cases of long-term abuse and imprisonment in Pennsylvania state history. But no one dared say it out loud until Dr. Phillips completed her comprehensive genetic analysis of Jessica and Amanda Ashford. The results confirmed what Margaret's journals had suggested. Both women carried genetic markers indicating they were the product of incestuous relationships, with further abnormalities suggesting continued inbreeding in subsequent generations. What truly shocked investigators was evidence suggesting that Jessica had given birth at least twice during her confinement, with Amanda showing similar signs of past pregnancies. The whereabouts of any children resulting from these pregnancies remained unaccounted for in the initial investigation, raising grim questions about what additional horrors might have occurred in the Ashford basement. That discovery was only the beginning of a deeper nightmare that would emerge as investigators continued searching the property through the summer of 2007. Behind a false wall in the garage, officers discovered a freezer containing biological specimens preserved in medical-grade containers. According to the forensic report, these specimens were fetal remains in various stages of development, each labeled with dates spanning from 1994 to 2004. The clinical organization of these remains suggested someone with medical knowledge had been involved, though no evidence could connect any local healthcare professionals to the Ashford case. This discovery shifted the investigation from one of imprisonment and abuse to serial infanticide, escalating the case to the highest priority for the Pennsylvania State Police. The psychological evaluation of Margaret Ashford revealed a mind compartmentalized to an extraordinary degree. Dr. Nathan Brooks, the forensic psychiatrist who conducted her assessment, described her as presenting two distinct psychological profiles depending on the subject of conversation. When discussing ordinary matters, Margaret demonstrated clarity of thought and awareness of social norms. However, when the conversation turned to Jessica and Amanda or the family project, she displayed what Dr. Brooks termed cult-like devotion to a biological imperative that had been instilled by her husband and brother-in-law decades earlier. Most disturbing was her continued belief that she had been performing a valuable scientific service through the isolation and documentation of genetic outcomes. According to the municipal archive records, Edward Ashford had briefly attended medical school at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1960s before withdrawing to pursue accounting. This partial medical training explained the clinical nature of the documentation and the anatomical precision evident in Margaret's journals, which investigators believed had been dictated by Edward rather than written in her own words. Richard Ashford's background revealed a more concerning pattern, with employment records showing he had worked as a laboratory technician at a genetics research facility in Philadelphia until 1967, when he was terminated for ethical concerns that were never specified in his personnel file. The psychological impact on Jessica and Amanda proved nearly impossible to assess completely. After their rescue, both women were transferred to a specialized care facility where they received their first proper medical treatment and psychological evaluation. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the psychologist assigned to their case, reported that decades of isolation had left them with severely limited communication abilities and profound attachment disorders. Neither woman could articulate their experiences in the basement, though both exhibited extreme anxiety when separated from each other and terror in the presence of older women resembling their grandmother. Most heartbreaking was their inability to comprehend the concept of the outside world, with simple experiences like feeling sunlight or seeing trees causing overwhelming emotional responses. What remained unexplained through months of investigation was how the Ashford family had maintained their secret for so long without detection. The answer emerged gradually as investigators interviewed former neighbors, mail carriers, and utility workers who had interacted with the family over the decades. A pattern of careful misdirection became apparent, with Edward and Margaret creating a narrative of caring for elderly relatives with dementia to explain any unusual sounds or smells emanating from the home. They strategically renovated the house to channel ventilation from the basement through the chimney, preventing odors from reaching neighboring properties. Most effectively, they fostered a reputation for privacy that discouraged casual visits, with Edward occasionally mentioning his work with confidential financial clients to explain their reluctance to welcome visitors. The Ashford case exposed critical failures in social services and community oversight that allowed such abuse to continue undetected for decades. A subsequent government inquiry revealed that concerns had been raised twice before, once in 1984 when a meter reader reported hearing unusual sounds from the basement, and again in 1991 when a postal worker noted a face in the basement window that disappeared quickly. In both instances, cursory investigations by different agencies found no cause for concern, with the Ashfords providing plausible explanations that were accepted without thorough verification. These missed opportunities for intervention resulted in comprehensive reforms to Pennsylvania's child welfare and adult protective services protocols, with the case study now featured in training programs throughout the state. The prosecution of Margaret Ashford became a complex legal challenge due to her advanced age and deteriorating mental condition. By the time charges were formally filed in late 2007, she had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, raising questions about her competency to stand trial. The district attorney's office pursued an aggressive case nonetheless, charging her with multiple counts of unlawful imprisonment, abuse of dependent adults, and accessory to sexual assault. The most serious charges related to the remains found in the freezer, with forensic evidence suggesting Margaret had participated in terminating pregnancies and preserving the remains. After lengthy competency hearings, the court determined she could stand trial, though her cognitive decline accelerated rapidly during the proceedings. In one of the most unusual legal maneuvers of the case, prosecutors arranged for Jessica and Amanda to testify via closed-circuit television, despite their limited verbal abilities. Their testimony consisted primarily of emotional responses to photographs of the basement and recordings of Margaret's voice, with psychologists interpreting their reactions for the jury. Defense attorneys challenged this approach as prejudicial, but the judge allowed it under provisions for accommodating witnesses with disabilities. The psychological impact of this experience on the women remained a subject of ethical debate within the legal community, long after the trial concluded. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts in April 2009. Margaret Ashford, by then 71 and requiring continuous medical care, was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The judge's remarks during sentencing were uncommonly emotional, describing the case as representing the most profound betrayal of the sacred trust between parent and child. Margaret showed no visible reaction to the verdict or sentence, maintaining the detached demeanor she had displayed throughout the proceedings. She was transferred to the medical wing of the State Correctional Facility at Muncie, where she died 17 months later from complications of pneumonia, having never expressed remorse or acknowledged the criminality of her actions. For Jessica and Amanda, the aftermath of their rescue presented challenges nearly as profound as their captivity. Unable to function independently after lifetimes of confinement and abuse, they became permanent residents of a specialized care facility in eastern Pennsylvania. Staff members reported slow but meaningful progress in their adaptation to normal living conditions, with both women gradually developing trust in their caregivers and expanding their vocabulary through intensive therapy. By 2011, they had progressed to supervised outdoor activities and rudimentary occupational therapy, though the genetic and developmental issues resulting from their inbreeding continued to limit their physical capabilities and cognitive function. The Ashford property remained vacant for years after the investigation concluded, becoming an unwanted landmark that attracted morbid curiosity seekers, despite police barriers. In 2012, the county commissioners voted unanimously to demolish the structure and establish a memorial garden on the site, with a small plaque acknowledging the survivors without sensationalizing the crimes. The decision to destroy rather than preserve the house came after consultation with mental health experts, who emphasized the importance of community healing over historical documentation. Before demolition, forensic teams conducted a final exhaustive search of the property, discovering additional journals hidden within the walls that provided further insights into the family's distorted ideology. These final journals, written primarily by Richard Ashford between 1965 and 2001, revealed the pseudo-scientific reasoning behind what the family had termed their genetic isolation experiment. Richard had apparently become obsessed with discredited eugenics theories during his time working in genetic research, developing a personal conviction that controlled inbreeding could produce purified genetic expressions, if managed scientifically. The journals detailed his recruitment of his brother Edward to this cause and their subsequent manipulation of Margaret from a young age to accept her role in their experiment. Most disturbing were Richard's expressions of disappointment that Jessica and Amanda had developed suboptimal traits rather than the enhanced characteristics he had theorized would emerge through their controlled breeding program. The legal ramifications of the Ashford case extended beyond criminal proceedings to include civil litigation against multiple government agencies that had failed to identify the abuse despite warning signs. Attorneys representing Jessica and Amanda filed suit against the County Children and Youth Services, the local police department, and the State Department of Human Services, citing negligence in following up on previous reports of suspicious activity at the Ashford home. After 3 years of legal proceedings, a settlement was reached providing lifetime care for both women and establishing a trust to fund research into rehabilitation methods for victims of extreme long-term isolation. The case established new legal precedents regarding the duty of care owed by public agencies to vulnerable individuals, resulting in legislative reforms that strengthened mandatory reporting requirements and increased funding for adult protective services. The profound psychological impact of the Ashford case extended to those involved in the investigation and subsequent care of the survivors. Officer Kendrick, who had first entered the basement, requested transfer to administrative duties 6 months after the discovery, citing persistent nightmares and symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Carol Winters, the social worker who initiated the welfare check, took early retirement and later became an advocate for reform in protective services, frequently citing the case in her testimony before legislative committees. Even Dr. Phillips, despite her extensive experience with trauma victims, acknowledged in a medical journal article that treating Jessica and Amanda had fundamentally altered her understanding of human resilience and the capacity for recovery from extreme abuse. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that other families in the community had noticed signs of something amiss at the Ashford home, but had chosen not to interfere out of misplaced respect for privacy. Interviews conducted during the investigation revealed that at least 5 neighbors had observed concerning behaviors over the years, including unusual nighttime activities, strange odors, and the sound of crying coming from the house when Margaret was known to be alone. In each instance, cultural norms regarding privacy and reluctance to make false accusations had prevented them from reporting their concerns to authorities. This aspect of the case prompted community soul-searching about the balance between respecting privacy and fulfilling civic responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals. The medical community's response to the Ashford case focused primarily on the genetic implications of multi-generational inbreeding and the developmental consequences of extreme isolation. Jessica and Amanda became subjects of numerous case studies in medical journals, with researchers documenting the physical and cognitive abnormalities resulting from their genetic heritage and environmental deprivation. These studies contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of how isolation affects neurological development, while also raising ethical questions about the appropriate boundaries of medical research involving traumatized individuals. Special protocols were developed to ensure that all examinations and studies were conducted with maximum sensitivity to the women's comfort and psychological well-being. Media coverage of the Ashford case represented its own ethical quandary, with news organizations struggling to balance public interest against the risk of exploitation. Initial reports featured sensationalistic headlines and graphic descriptions that mental health advocates criticized as re-traumatizing for survivors of abuse. In response, several major news outlets developed new guidelines for reporting on cases involving vulnerable victims, emphasizing dignity over sensationalism and providing context for understanding the systemic failures that enable such abuse. The case became a standard example in journalism ethics courses, illustrating the responsibility of media to inform without causing additional harm to victims or encouraging copycat behavior. The long-term outcomes for Jessica and Amanda represented both the limitations and possibilities of recovery from extreme trauma. By 2015, 8 years after their rescue, both women had achieved modest but meaningful improvements in their quality of life. According to their care providers, they had developed the ability to express basic preferences and engage in simple recreational activities, though both remained profoundly disabled and dependent on continuous support. Their strongest connection remained with each other, with staff noting that they continued to communicate through a private language of gestures and sounds developed during their years of isolation. Despite the horrors they had endured, they occasionally displayed moments of joy that caregivers described as small triumphs of the human spirit over unimaginable adversity. The Ashford property, after its demolition and conversion to a memorial garden, became the site of annual community events focused on child welfare and abuse prevention. Local schools incorporated age-appropriate discussions of the case into their safety curriculum, emphasizing the importance of reporting concerns about classmates or neighbors who might be in danger. The garden itself was designed with input from trauma specialists, featuring healing plants and quiet spaces for reflection, rather than explicit references to the crimes that had occurred there. This transformation represented the community's determination to create meaning from tragedy, transforming a site of horror into a space dedicated to prevention and healing. In a final, unsettling development that emerged years after the main investigation concluded, authorities in 2017 discovered evidence suggesting the Ashford case might not have been entirely isolated. Analysis of Richard Ashford's personal correspondence revealed communications with individuals in at least 3 other states who expressed interest in similar genetic isolation experiments. While no direct evidence confirmed that these communications led to actual abuse cases, the FBI opened investigations into several individuals named in the letters. This discovery raised the disturbing possibility that the ideology driving the Ashford's crimes might have spread beyond their immediate family, potentially inspiring similar cases that remain undiscovered. Today, the Ashford case serves as a cautionary example in multiple professional fields, from law enforcement to social work to medical ethics. The systematic failures that allowed the abuse to continue for decades have been studied extensively, resulting in improved protocols for interagency communication and more thorough investigation of welfare concerns. The physical and psychological damage inflicted on Jessica and Amanda continues to inform research into recovery from extreme trauma, while their ongoing care represents society's commitment to supporting even the most profoundly victimized individuals. Yet despite all that has been learned, questions remain about how a family could descend into such depravity while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy, and how similar cases might be identified before they span generations. What happened in the basement of the Ashford home forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of social safeguards against evil. The case demonstrates how isolation can become both a tool and outcome of abuse, creating closed systems where perpetrators establish complete control over their victims' reality. It reveals how ordinary neighborhoods can conceal extraordinary horrors, and how respect for privacy can sometimes enable continued suffering. Most disturbingly, it shows how abusers can manipulate scientific concepts to justify cruelty, wrapping sadism in the language of experimentation to rationalize the unthinkable. The story of Jessica and Amanda Ashford reminds us that vigilance is not merely a virtue, but a necessity in protecting the most vulnerable members of our communities. As for Margaret Ashford, her final days in prison offered no redemption narrative or deathbed confession. According to prison staff, she maintained until the end that her actions had been justified by the importance of the research being conducted in her home. This unwavering belief in the righteousness of her crimes represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case, suggesting that human beings can become so thoroughly indoctrinated into destructive ideologies that they lose all moral compass. Psychiatric experts continue to debate whether Margaret's devotion to her husband's twisted vision represented mental illness, coercive control, or a genuine embrace of evil, with no consensus emerging from these discussions. Her case file remains open in the archives of forensic psychology, a disturbing example of how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty when isolated from normal social constraints. The legacy of the Ashford case extends beyond its immediate implications for the fields directly involved in addressing abuse. It has become a touchstone for broader societal reflection on the tension between community involvement and individual privacy, and on the responsibility of citizens to remain vigilant for signs of suffering among their neighbors. While respect for boundaries remains an important social value, the case illustrates the dangers of allowing that respect to override concerns about potential abuse. In the years since the discovery, anonymous reporting of suspected abuse has increased significantly in Pennsylvania and surrounding states. suggesting a cultural shift toward prioritizing protection over privacy when vulnerable individuals may be at risk. This change represents perhaps the most meaningful memorial to Jessica and Amanda Ashford, whose suffering has made communities more willing to speak up when they sense something is wrong. Some questions about the Ashford case will likely never be answered completely. The full extent of Richard and Edward's network of like-minded individuals remains unknown, as does the fate of all children potentially born in the basement over decades of abuse. Investigators acknowledge that evidence may remain undiscovered, buried on remote properties, or hidden in plain sight through careful documentation. The most troubling question, whether similar cases exist undiscovered in other communities, continues to haunt professionals in protective services. The Ashford case serves as a reminder that the most heinous crimes can sometimes occur behind ordinary facades, in quiet neighborhoods where no one thinks to question why the curtains are always drawn or why children are never seen playing in the yard. In that uncertainty lies perhaps the most important lesson, that vigilance is not paranoia, and that concerned inquiry may sometimes be the only thing standing between vulnerable individuals and decades of unspeakable suffering.